The US crisis diplomacy is in full swing. The recently reignited Middle East conflict is just one of the many crises and wars that the US is currently having to deal with. President Biden has made a personal visit to Israel and met Prime Minister Netanyahu, following the earlier deployment of 2 US aircraft carriers to the Mediterranean to deter Iran. At the same time, the US government is also supplying weapons and financial support in the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, a situation that many in the US have started to find overwhelming. Meanwhile, China, America's primary geopolitical rival, is busy expanding its global influence at the Silk Road Summit. Is the US having too many balls to juggle at once? And could Xi and Putin ultimately be the ones to reap the benefits? Today on To The Point, we ask, superpower under strain, how many global conflicts can the US cope with? Hello and welcome to The Point. I'm Isha Bhatia-Sanin here in Berlin. Let me quickly introduce my guests to you. We have Nico Lange. He is Senior Fellow at the Munich Security Conference and former Chief of Staff of the German Ministry of Defense. Next on the panel is Joseph Bramel. He is a political analyst and the European Director of the Trilateral Commission, a global platform for dialogue between America, Europe, and Asia. And we have Sudha David Wilp. She is a Senior Fellow and the Regional Director of the German Marshall Fund in Berlin. A very warm welcome to you all. Thank you for joining. Sudha, there is the Middle East crisis right now. Then we also have Ukraine and Russia. And then we also have China, Taiwan. Which of all of these crises is something that bothers US the most? Which is the most dangerous one where they need to focus most at the moment?
Well, I think unfortunately, all three are interconnected, and there is an issue where the U.S. has to pay attention to all three crises in the world, hopefully together with allies, because without doing it together with partners, the U.S. will probably at some point, and is already feeling overstretched. I think there was an expectation that Europe will do more for Ukraine eventually, especially as the U.S. enters an election year. The Middle East is focusing a lot of energy for the U.S. administration right now, and we've seen this, playbook in the past. Many U.S. presidents get embroiled in Middle East policy, but I think at one point President Biden will have to pivot towards his re-election.
Nico, the US has been steering away from the Middle East for some time and focusing more on China and Pacific. But now the US feels the need to focus more on the Middle East. Would you say that they are back in the role of global sheriff?
What we can clearly see is when the US started to retreat from certain areas of the world, the situation got worse. One of the reasons is that the Europeans were not capable of filling the gap themselves. But now we see America has to be a decisive factor in many crises. That we have European unity when it comes to supporting Ukraine against Russian aggression is an achievement of the Biden administration. It's not an achievement of the Europeans themselves, but I agree with Sudha. I mean, if the US has to dedicate so many resources to the conflicts we are talking about, I think the Europeans have to step up, especially when it comes to supporting Ukraine. And we are not observers in this. Germany's interests are in Europe, they are in the Middle East, they are in Asia. So Germany cannot expect the US helping to fulfill Germany's interests. Germany has to get involved itself.
Isha, if I can just also clarify before you go to Joseph, the reason that all three of these countries are interconnected is because they're all on the front lines of democracies in very dangerous areas. And it's in the United States' interest, as well as partners, to defend democratic values and also to try to uphold an already stressed international, rules-based international order.
Joseph, would you say it was a strategic mistake to disengage from the Middle East for so long?
I think so. And we sent signals of weakness that may have emboldened the one or the other dictator. I mean, when Barack Obama, we all love him, but he drew a red line in Syria, and it turned out to be a pink line, That's not how deterrence works. He said if you use chemical weapons, we will answer. No answer from Washington. The withdrawal from Afghanistan didn't look heroic to other autocrats. So they may not be forgiven, but they may have calculated America's weak, has problems to defend its own democracy. We may have to talk about Trump and the front line of defending democracy. I think that's in America, because we all depend on America. So the Russians, the Chinese, and all the others cannot do to us what America is doing to itself right now. So that's the biggest problem. So add everything together, then we don't have the guardian of the rule-based order, which used to be America, and we have to live in a world now that has been described as Zeitenwende. We woke up late, but hopefully we stay awake and not dream or sleepwalk into the next crises.
Woke up late, but finally woken up. So at the moment, the Middle East seems to be the top priority for the U.S. government. The U.S. wants to ensure that the conflict does not escalate beyond Gaza.
It's a dangerous trip at a highly explosive time. The U.S. president is visiting Israel with a clear message.
I want you to know you're not alone. You are not alone. As I emphasized earlier, we will continue to have Israel's back as you work to defend your people.
U.S. diplomacy is in full swing. Israel, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Egypt. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is touring the Middle East to mediate and find solutions. Under discussion is also the precarious situation of the Palestinians trapped in the Gaza Strip. In Cairo, the U.S. and Egypt are discussing how to get aid from Egypt into Gaza without triggering a feared mass exodus into Egypt itself. At the same time, America is sending clear military signals. It is moving fighter jets and more warships to the region. Above all, the move is about deterrence, not only for Hamas, but also for other terrorist organizations supported by Iran, such as Hezbollah in Lebanon. Most recently, U.S. peace efforts had focused primarily on reconciliation between Saudi Arabia and Israel. But the war is now reshuffling the cards in the Middle East. Can the U.S. prevent a broader war flaring up in the region?
So, your thoughts on that? Can the U.S. really prevent flaring up the war in this region? Can Biden really contain this?
I mean, right now, President Biden, the U.S. is still the leading force in the world, the leading power, the leading hegemon. And President Biden must do something to try to stop a conflagration of the Middle East. But he can only do it also with partners. Chancellor Scholz was also in Egypt. Annalena Baerbock was also in the Middle East. So it is in our interest to make sure that stability can be achieved. But first and foremost, Israel does need to react to what happened last week. And Hamas is sort of discredited itself as a party to negotiate with. Hamas must be dismantled, and Israel has the right to exist. But certainly the hope is that eventually this two-state solution could get back on track, and a warming of relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel can move forward. But first, the hostages need to be released, and Israel also has to make a statement and not let what happened last week go unanswered.
Since you mentioned Scholz, how were the two visits different, Scholz's and Biden's, when it comes to the outcomes?
Well, I mean, first off, because of the horrible tragedy with the hospital, President Biden was not, didn't get the opportunity to meet with Abbas and with other Arab leaders. Chancellor Scholz managed to have a meeting in Egypt. So, but I still think that what the U.S. does, what it signals, comes first, and the Europeans usually fall in line, or there may be nuances that would maybe help the situation. But for the most part, I think Europe and the U.S. must try to remain in lockstep, just as they have done with Ukraine.
But can U.S. continue the task of mediation if the Arab leaders refuse to meet?
Yes, I think so. I mean, the situation about the tragedy when it comes to the hospital is more clear now. I think the combination of sending a carrier strike group and sending diplomats is the right one. And it's only the US can provide this. Unfortunately, we do, as Europeans, we do not have those instruments at our disposal. That is our weakness we have to work on. The distinction between the terror organization Hamas and the Arab population in Gaza, I think, is very important. Unfortunately, we in Germany are not good enough in making that distinction. So far, what I've seen from the US is something I think that could be helpful, and we have to say it's early, but so far it's working. Deterring Hezbollah from joining the war against Israel, I think, is the most important immediate issue. Many further developments would develop on that, and so far I think the US is setting the right tone there.
There are about 2 million civilians in Gaza, and half of which are children. Is the US working on getting a humanitarian corridor for them?
They're doing that, but what is more important is that there are not more of that. So to keep both Hezbollah out of the war and Iran, so the clear signal deterrence is important. As bad as it is right now, it could be a lot worse. So that's the most important. So this doesn't enlarge, and US are the only credible voice who can do both. Assure security. They are the security guarantor, even of Israel. I mean, who would have thought that Israel would be surprised like that? I mean, this has been amazing to many of us. So it needs America, but America is only the other force who can also say, don't overdo it, don't make the same mistake as we did after 9/11. So military force is not the only solution. I mean, Biden knows what
Yes.
Americans are talking about it. So if we did that, we would have a problem, especially we in Germany. But America is credible on that one. And I think if somebody manages, it's the American president, if God and his health would allow for that.
And President Biden did just that. I mean, he talked about Israel's right to self-defense, but also differentiated between Hamas and the Palestinian people. And also mentioned that, there has to be a humane way to let civilians cross. And so I do think that President Biden has also told Israel, don't let revenge consume you. Think about what your next steps are. And I do think that President Biden still wants to somehow achieve a two-state solution. Don't forget, President Biden and President Obama didn't have the best relationship with Netanyahu. And so I do think that President Biden loves Israel, but is also aware of the different players that are at the table, and he's best, with his experience, he's the best person we have to try to get some stability back into that
But
region.
the humanitarian aid is still not reaching there, as we saw in the
They're
report.
working on it. I mean, I know that they're working on it as right. There is constant shuttle diplomacy going on right now, and hopefully there will be a breakthrough.
Now, a lot of experts are saying that if a ground offensive, which is planned, if that happens, that's probably not a very good idea. Is it too late, or can it still be stopped?
We don't know what the IDF is really planning. I think they are doing well in not telling anybody. The ground offensive is an assumption. From a strictly military point of view, a ground offensive in a densely populated area is always a very, very difficult, long and dangerous endeavor, because it develops into three-dimensional warfare. The problem is, I think, that Hamas is using the civil population of the area to avoid being hit by IDF. And it's, I think, a combination of special operations and ground operations that can maybe find a way around that. But let's be clear. This terror attack on Israel, there needs to, from a point of view of the security of Israel, which is also raison d'etat of Germany, there needs to be an answer to that. And I share the view of IDF that Hamas as a terrorist organization needs to be destroyed to provide security for Israel. And the question how to have a distinction, again, to separate the terrorists from Hamas and the population that wants just a normal civil life, is something that we did not pay attention enough to, I think, also for the last decades.
Right.
Because there would be possibilities to organize a better life in Gaza. There would have been possibilities before, but Hamas was taking over. The authorities are not playing the role they could have played. Maybe there is a way to transform this into a situation where a better life is possible in Gaza after this.
So the ground offensive is still an assumption. But if it were to happen, would the US still support Israel financially and technically?
Of course.
There's no question about that.
That's what Biden made clear.
And if, in that case, if Israel were to take Gaza Strip, then US would still continue?
Sure.
Okay, clear words. Talking about current sentiment in the US, how are people in America looking at this?
Well, I think the sympathy lies very much with Israel. But of course, you know, there is a split in the Democratic Party to some degree. You do see people also in college campuses, unfortunately, I think not necessarily having enough information and realizing the difference between Hamas and the Palestinian people. And so I do think that the government, no matter Republican or Democrat, will always support Israel, just like for Germany. Israel is an important, valuable partner for the United States. But I do think that the United States also would like to see a two-state solution. No matter how hard it is, that goal should not be given up. We've made now, obviously, moved backwards on that path. But hopefully, as Nico Lang said, it may take a tragedy to try to get people to talk about this again.
You wanted to pitch in?
Not necessarily, but I mean, what policymakers want and do is one thing. I mean, it's clear in Germany and in US, but take Arab states, you know, this Abraham Accords, I think that's off the table right now. That was the cynical calculation of Hamas, not only at the expense of its own people to gain power within Palestine or territories, though that's their cynical power game, and to destroy that peace movement, because they would be out of business. I mean, warfighters, terrorists are not in a good position when there will be peace. And Arab states who have neglected, you know, the two-state solution, I mean, they weren't really interested when you remember WikiLeaks and what all they said and not did. And now they have to be aware of their population. Not only in Harvard, you have to be careful what you say, because there are so many people who do not differentiate. I mean, in these regions of the world, I mean, the leaders have to be careful not to be swept away by their street folk. So let's not be too optimistic about peace solutions. Let's just contain the situation and avoid a bigger war.
Contain the situation and think carefully about what our contribution from a German and European point of view should be. Because, yes, we are on the side of Israel, that's very clear. Yes, we have diplomatic possibilities, and the Chancellor showed that with going to Cairo. But at the same time, it sounds paradox, but more support for Ukraine from a military point of view could be exactly what would be needed, while the focus of the US is necessarily very much on the Middle East. And the US is the only one really with the tools to achieve a solution in the Middle East. So it's again a connection between the different conflicts. But I'm convinced we need to step up now to support Ukraine, to give Biden more headspace to work also on other issues, and also to build a bridge towards the resources discussion in the US. I think if the Europeans would contribute more and be on eye level when it comes to help for Ukraine, also the whole argument for a budget will be easier within the US.
I'd like to come back to Ukraine in a bit. The US government currently is not only facing challenges on the international front, but is also encountering significant hurdles in the domestic politics, particularly from the Republicans.
Domestic politics. U.S. President Biden took office with the aim of reconciling a deeply divided society. After the polarizing Trump years, he wanted to bring the political camps closer together, so far without success. There is chaos in the House of Representatives. There are budget disputes. And Donald Trump may well stand again as Biden's Republican opponent. The Ukraine war. The counteroffensive is threatening to become a bloody trench war. New funding for weapons to Ukraine is being blocked by the domestic political turmoil. Power struggle with China. Here, too, there is hardly any progress on delicate points of contention, such as Taiwan or advanced technology. Despite so many crises, the U.S. is asserting itself, also with respect to the Middle East and Ukraine.
We're the United States of America, for God's sake. The most powerful nation in the history, not in the world, in the history of the world. The history of the world. We can take care of both of these and still maintain our overall international defense.
Can the U.S. manage multiple crises at once?
Sudha, can the U.S. manage two wars at the same time? It has domestic issues to deal with as well.
Sure, the United States can definitely manage the polycrisis world that we live in, but we can't do it alone. We need to do it with partners. And also, President Biden has to be careful, of course, about domestic sentiments because the American people are tired of these endless wars. Ever since, after George W. Bush has been in office, America has shown more restraint. But unfortunately or fortunately, it seems clear that the United States has to maintain a presence, has to show deterrence. Otherwise, the rules of the jungle will, be sort of the rules that we have to contend with. So, unfortunately, also the United States, because everything actually is relatively going well, the economy is quite strong compared to other industrialized countries, but we seem to be making our own goals because of our polarization and inability to work together in D.C., and we're seeing that playing out right now in the House of Representatives.
You were talking about Ukraine. Now, Ukraine is concerned that the Middle East crisis would have an impact on them and they might not get the financial aid that they've been getting. Is the concern justified?
I think the concern is about the combination of the specific situation in the political system in the US and the non-approval of budgets and the attention the US is now dedicating to the Middle East. And in Ukraine, it's a very practical matter. It's not about political support. It's about military support. And if ammunition is running out, if certain types of weapons are running out, then Ukraine will have a weaker position. And Russia, at the same time, while we are talking, is trying to gain the initiative, to seize the initiative on the battlefield, because they know that it is a problem for Ukraine if the US support would not be there anymore. We will see if the US will find a solution. There is talk about a 100 billion package that might include help for Israel and for Ukraine and other elements as well that could solve the situation. But the US has to elect a speaker first, and the time is running, and Russia is attacking. That is the situation as we speak. So I think also that points to a necessity that the Europeans are stepping up, also to give Ukraine more confidence in the situation, because it changes the calculations clearly already on the Russian side.
The Republicans are not able to agree on a speaker. How does that affect America's reputation across the world?
Well, it shows that we're paralyzed and we're dysfunctional in Washington because there is a lot of bipartisan consensus when it comes to Ukraine. If you look at the Senate, Republicans and Democrats both think that Ukraine is in the national interest. And the same goes with Israel. I think in both chambers of the Congress that support for Israel is a must. But without having a speaker, no laws can be passed, no money can be allocated towards these regions. And so we're facing a situation where the U.S. is looking like a banana republic when it comes to governing.
If Biden were to resolve one of these conflicts, how would that help him in the upcoming elections?
I think he will try to tell Zelensky, if he hasn't done so far, I think he has done so far, to come to terms with some solution, because Biden doesn't want to have the Ukraine issue in the election. It's not only unpopular with Republicans. Look at the front runners. Nobody wants to really defend Ukraine. You have Mitch McConnell.
Disagree with that.
People worry about his health. You know, sometimes he's in the wrong movie. I mean, he reassured us in Munich at the Munich Security Conference, but he couldn't make a deal was then Speaker McCarthy, because they did Ukraine support out. And now the last deal they made, it was at the expense of Ukraine. So Ukraine is not an issue you run on to win an election in the U.S. So don't be surprised if Biden...
Nobody runs on foreign policy in the U.S.
But that was the assumption.
Yeah.
So let's put it differently. Biden will try to get Ukraine out of the electoral campaign because he has a son who is still in the Burisma in the Ukraine mess, and Democrats don't want to have that. So I'm afraid Ukraine, and here I agree with you, will be our problem. America has different problems, especially in Asia and China.
And we cannot discuss Ukraine anywhere. And even if we say they have to come to terms, that does not change the situation.
Nope.
The reality is shaped by the reality on the battlefield.
We have last 10 seconds, so that you disagree. You have your
Well,
last sentence.
nobody runs on foreign policy issues in the U.S. when it comes to politics. It's all kitchen table issues. We'll be looking at inflation.
You will see Trump. He will be running on that, and then this will make Biden to change his position.
That's
But he
all
will
the time
lose.
we
But he will
got.
lose.
That's all the time we got. How many global
Keep your hopes up.
conflicts can the U.S. really cope with? What do you think about it? If you're watching us on YouTube, do let us know your thoughts. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.